Welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of the show in the show notes at www.7, so seven health.com/44.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another installment of Real Health Radio. This is another show where it's just me on my own covering a specific topic, and this week I'm talking all about protein. So back in April, I did an episode all about carbohydrates, and it was a real success with lots of downloads and emails from people. And I said at the time when I did that show that I plan to do an episode on protein and also on fat. So this is the installment on protein, and at some future date, I'll also do one on fat. So what I want to do as part of the show is cover what protein is used for in the body. And as you're about to say, this is a fairly extensive list. Protein, or more specifically amino acids, are used for basically every organ, every system, every transaction in the body. So when looking at this stuff, for some of it, I'm going to go into more detail, and for others, I'm just going to give a one-sentence mention. Otherwise, this show could literally go on for hours. After that, I'm going to go through other aspects of protein intake that I think are important. So things like the bioavailability of different sources, how much protein you need and how you can roughly work this out, animal sources versus vegetarian sources, and then looking at specific amino acids, which is what protein is broken down to, and just talking about a couple of these. As always, I'm going to keep this as easy to understand for the layperson as possible. So if there are any technical sounding words, I'm going to explain what they mean or why they're important. But to start with, before jumping into protein's role in the body, let me explain what protein is and also how protein is digested. So the word protein refers to a type of molecule in food that can be broken down into amino acids. And depending on which textbook you buy, the total number of different amino acids varies between 20 and 22. And so amino acids can be broken down into two categories. You have essential amino acids and non-essential amino acid. And an essential amino acid is one that the body cannot make on its own, but it has to come in from the diet. The number of essential amino acids, again, varies depending on who you read, and it's anywhere between 8 and 10. The remaining amino acids are then known as non-essential amino acids, as the body is then able to make it themselves. So what they're able to do is take the essential amino acids and then create them or turn them into the non-essential amino acids. There's actually a third category on top of just the essential and the non-essential, which is called conditionally essential. And this refers to the fact that some non-essential amino acids, in theory, the body can make them itself. But the reality is that in specific times or under specific circumstances, there's a much higher need for those non-essential amino acids. And what this means is that the body isn't able to create enough of them just using those essential ones. So the body's not able to keep up with the demand that's being asked for them. So what this means is that you need to be getting some of these non-essential amino acid coming through the diet to then make up enough. So what this means is in those situations, they become known as conditionally essential. In terms of protein digestion, the stomach is really important as this first port of call. So the stomach is an incredibly acidic environment, and this is largely due to the hydrochloric acid. And there are three main reasons why it's so acidic. One of the big reasons is to do with breaking down protein, which I'll get to in a second. The other is to help to break away minerals. And the third is that your stomach is also part of your immune system. So anything that has come in attached to your food in terms of bacteria or viruses, that kind of stuff, because of the acidity, it can then start to break down and use it as a form of defense. So with the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, in terms of protein, this acidity helps to start to denature the protein. So this means breaking apart its structure. The low amount of pH, so the low pH means acidity. The lower the pH, the greater the acidity. So the low pH in the stomach is important for digestion as well, because it releases, or it triggers the release of an enzyme called pepsin. And pepsin starts to break down protein into smaller peptides or particles. So peptides are chains of 2 or more amino acids. So the same way as you, with carbohydrates, you can have saccharides. So you have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, which means 1, 2, or long chain of carbohydrates. You have the same thing in terms of protein. So when something is known as a peptide, it means that there is like 2 or more amino acids that are joined together. And so what this pepsin, as well as the hydrochloric acid, start to do is to denature and break down the protein, and then start to break it into smaller chunks. The digestion of protein then continues in the small intestine with further enzymes, and these enzymes then are coming from the pancreas in the small intestine, and these are further helping with digestion. And so by the time that digestion is finished, the peptides have then been broken down into single amino acids. And these amino acids are then absorbed through the small intestine, normally towards the very end of the small intestine, and they get absorbed through the small intestine into the blood and into the lymphatic system, and then they move around the body wherever they're needed, and then they start to do their various roles that I'm going to get to in a second. So the first role that I want to mention that protein has in the body is the one that most people think of when they think of the word protein, which is building muscle. So this can be part of the everyday turnover of muscle, because we're constantly breaking down the old and building up the new. So it can be just part of that very standard function. It can be part of healing in terms of this injury. It can be part of recovering from surgery. So if there's even more of that breakdown through injury or through surgery. It can also then be part of building bigger muscle mass that was never there to begin with. So people going to the gym or doing some kind of exercise that then leads to bigger muscle mass being built. So this is something I'm not going to go into very much detail, because most people are pretty familiar with protein and thinking about protein from this perspective. What I would just say is that it's not just the muscles that people think about with this stuff. So it's not just getting bigger biceps or getting bigger glutes or whatever. It also includes other muscles. So like the muscles in the heart. It also includes the muscles in your blood vessels. So protein is important for all of the different types of muscles within the body. So the next use for protein is with the creation of collagen and also for the creation of bone. So collagen is the main protein in connective tissue, so things like tendons, ligaments, cartilage. And it's really the substance that holds the whole body together. On the bone front, protein intake helps in a number of different ways. So it's part of the structural matrix of the bone. So you'll have bits of protein as part of that. It also impacts on IGF-1. So IGF-1 is a hormone and it has lots of different functions within the body, but in terms of bone health, it encourages bone mineralization and therefore having less fractures, and protein can help to encourage this. Protein intake also impacts on urinary calcium excretion and also calcium absorption in the intestine. So as calcium, as most people know, is crucial for bone health, if protein intake impacts on calcium status via excretion and also absorption, then this also indirectly affects bone health. Protein is needed as part of detoxification, and particularly in terms of liver's function in detoxification. I know that the word detox or detoxification can set off some alarm bells in people's head. Like the whole wellness and nutrition field is awash with lots of very dubious detox regimes. And so if you hear the word detox and you instantly become skeptical, like I understand why. I actually did a whole show on detoxification, which I'm going to link to in the show notes, which I really encourage you to check out because it looks at like what is true and what is not true about detoxification and how the process really works within the body. But in a nutshell, there are two main phases of detoxification that are involved as part of the liver. And both of these phases of detoxification, protein and specific amino acids, are really integral as part of this. So making sure someone is taking in adequate amounts of protein is really important, and it is something I focus a lot on with clients, especially if I'm looking at detoxification relating to different hormones, particularly reproductive hormones. Protein is actually needed for proper digestion, and this is particularly in the stomach. So I mentioned at the beginning that hydrochloric acid and the acidity within the stomach is important for breaking down protein. Well, to actually create the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, one of the component parts of this is protein. So you get this catch-22 situation because you need hydrochloric acid to digest protein, but you then need protein to actually create hydrochloric acid. So if someone has weakened stomach acidity, protein can be important to help with this, but it can also be difficult for them to digest. So there'll often be people who get turned off eating meat, get turned off eating heavy protein because it feels like it sits really heavy for them. And they think by lowering their protein, it takes away some of those symptoms. And it may, but in the long run, it's then going to have more of a detrimental effect on their digestion. So it's then looking at ways of how can we make this easier for people in terms of digestion so they can then upregulate that hydrochloric acid and get stomach acidity back and get stomach digestion back to help with that protein. And some of those things I'll chat about later on. But it's not just the stomach that protein's needed for with digestion. It's also helpful for protecting the lining of the whole gastrointestinal tract. And this is because of one of the things I mentioned earlier on, the gastrointestinal tract, a lot of it is muscles and collagen based. So the protein, as I mentioned before, is needed for this, and that's why it can be so supportive to the digestive tract. Protein helps to promote alertness, to promote memory and learning. A lot of this is linked to protein's impact on the nervous system. It helps with the maintenance of the myelin sheath, which is the outer protection of the axon of the nerve cell. So if you think about your nervous system in the same way as you think about a power cord, and a power cord, obviously electricity goes through it, and that's in a lot of ways what's going through your nervous system. You have this outer lining that then insulates the electrical cord so that charge runs along the cord and keeps going where it should. And really that's what the myelin sheath does. It insulates that electrical charge so it can run along and keep going from nerve to go through the whole nervous system to create the changes that needs to happen. But it's not just the myelin sheath. Protein's needed for the production of neurotransmitters. So these are chemical messengers that are used by your nervous system. So just like your hormones are part of your endocrine system, you have neurotransmitters that are part of your nervous system. And what these substances do when they're released, they create certain changes in the body. And a number of these changes have impacts on alertness and memory and learning. If we're still looking at alertness and memory and learning, protein also has an impact on energy use pathways in the brain. So it helps to upregulate the brain's ability to utilize sugars, particularly glucose, which is why your brain can then work so effectively. And so basically, if you have a protein deficiency, it reduces the brain's ability or the brain cells to process information, leading to learning disabilities or difficulty in memorizing or delayed response. Protein aids in sexual arousal and in sexual function. So to start with, some of your sex hormones are made from protein. So things like follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. And these are often talked about more for women, and people focus more of them on for women, but they're important for men as well. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, really important as part of creating the egg and ovulation for women, but for men, really important as part of sperm production. Getting adequate amounts of protein is also important for the state that it puts the body in. And sexual function is really low on the body's priority list. Like, it wants to know that you are safe and secure first before it starts to think about this stuff. And when protein is too low, it then starts to prioritize safety and security over reproduction. Adequate protein is also needed for testosterone production. And the same is true of carbohydrates and fats, and probably more so for carbs and fats, but protein is also important for testosterone. And while testosterone is thought of as a male hormone, this is really not true. And testosterone is important for both men and women, both from a reproductive perspective, but from other reasons or for other roles as well. So for women, having adequate amounts of testosterone is important in terms of libido and sex drive, as well as it is for men, but obviously men, it just has much more of an important role. You definitely don't need to go overboard with protein, and particularly if we're talking about for testosterone, there is a tipping point where the more and more protein you actually have, the less and less testosterone you start to produce. But making sure that there is enough of a baseline is really important. And it's not just the reproductive hormones, but protein has an effect or is needed for the production of other hormones. So things like insulin, glucagon, human growth hormone, gastrin, and many others are either needing protein as their like building blocks or needing protein for other reasons that impact on their either function or their production. Protein is helpful in terms of energy production and for balancing blood sugar levels. And this is another one, say, similar to building muscle that a lot of people have heard of. And it's not uncommon when speaking to clients that they mention that they know that they need to have protein, or they need to have protein with certain meals to help to balance out blood sugars. Protein isn't a great energy source within itself. And of all the macronutrients, so carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, it is the least helpful, with the body preferring to use carbohydrates and then fats as its energy source. But when protein is consumed in adequate amounts, it actually helps to improve blood glucose response, and this then increases the body's ability to use carbohydrates as an energy source. It also contributes by increasing the production of different satiety hormones. So this can help someone to feel fuller for longer, and this can then help with, if not in terms of blood sugar balance, at least keeping someone more on the even keel in terms of their eating and their satiety levels. Proteins needed for proper function of your immune system. And this happens for a real range of different reasons. So for the production and the function of white blood cells, for creating antibodies, for suppressing growth tumors, decreasing pain and inflammation. I mean, adequate protein really is just so important for many, many aspects of the immune system. So to save this section then going on any longer, I'm just going to list like some of the remaining roles of protein. So the production and function of red blood cells, it protects the body from radiation damage. It's used for the removal of heavy metals. It's an antioxidant. It promotes eye health and vision. It helps to modulate cholesterol. It aids in the function of RNA and DNA, and it helps with modulation of blood pressure. And this list is definitely not exhaustive, and I probably missed lots of stuff out, but hopefully just from hearing what I've gone through here, you can start to see, and it can start to demonstrate how many roles protein has to play within the body and why having it in adequate amounts can have such a positive or negative effect if someone's not having enough at a real body-wide level. So I now want to look at some of the other aspects of protein that I think are useful. So firstly, to start with something rather basic, which is what are the different sources of protein? So protein can be broken down into two broad categories. One of those is coming from animal origin, and the other is those coming from vegetable origin. So if I'm looking at protein sources from animal origin, you've got the common ruminant animals, so beef and lamb. You then have like birds, so chicken and turkey. You then have game animals, so things like venison and springbok. You have game birds, so things like partridge and pheasant and that kind of thing. You have seafood, so crabs and prawns and oysters and mussels. You then have different fish, so you've got white fish and then also oily fish. You have eggs. You then have dairy, so things like cheese and milk and butter, although butter's probably not a great source, and then cream, although cream's probably not a great source in terms of protein. And then you have more of the powders, so things like whey protein or gelatin powder. You then have the protein sources from vegetable origin, so the various types of soy, so soy milk. You have like tofu or tempeh. You have corn products. You have things like spirulina. Vegetables, so things like potatoes or corn can be sources of protein. Different grains, so quinoa, brown rice. You have pulses like lentils and kidney beans and peas. You have legumes, so green beans and snow peas. All the different nuts, so almonds, cashews, Brazil nuts. Various seeds, so pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds. And then you have the vegetarian sources of protein powders, so soya protein isolate or pea protein, and that can be powders. It can also be different bars or things that are shakes or whatever. So they're your various different sources of protein. And what I would say is certain foods will have higher or lower amounts of those. So in terms of potatoes, it's normally thought about as a carbohydrate source, but potatoes will have some protein in it. Something like a piece of lamb is going to have much higher amounts of protein in it, but is also then going to have some fat contained within that as well, probably not very much carbohydrates. So most foods you'll find have not just one macronutrient, but will have multiple macronutrients, but normally will just be high in one or possibly multiple. So something like dairy, depending on which dairy we're talking about, can have all three of them in fairly decentish amounts. With all foods, it doesn't matter what nutrients it has in them. What is more important is how much you then get out of that stuff. And this is impacted on your ability to digest. And if we're looking at protein, we're looking at like your ability to digest the protein, but also then your ability to then absorb the protein. And these are definitely separate things, because you may be able to digest the protein and broke it down, say in the stomach or in the first part of the small intestine, but you then may have certain anti-nutrients or other substances that mean you may not then be able to absorb and assimilate the broken down amino acids. So what this is known as is bioavailability of protein. And it's looking at the collective capacity to both digest and absorb proteins. And different sources of protein have different bioavailability levels. And so while you can eat two foods that have the exact same amount of protein in them, what you actually digest at the end of these two meals and what you actually absorb at the end of these two meals can be very different. In a general sense, foods that come from animal sources have a higher protein availability or bioavailability than those that come from vegetarian sources. And so for eating things as an example like eggs or whey protein, you'll get nearly all of the protein that is in this food. And obviously there's going to be individual variations and how good someone's stomach acid is or other enzymes are, etc., that are going to impact on this. But in a general sense, you will get pretty much most of the protein, if not all the protein, out of like eggs and whey protein. For things like meat and fish and dairy, the percentage is going to be more like somewhere between like 70, 80, 85%, somewhere in that kind of ballpark. If we're then looking at things like nuts or seeds or beans or pulses, the number can then vary anywhere from about like 50% downwards to being in the teens. And so this isn't to say that you can't be vegan or vegetarian and getting all the protein that you need. Like, you definitely can. And it's definitely not to say that vegetarian or vegan sources of protein are worthless, because they're definitely not. But just being aware that the amount that you actually get out of different vegetarian or vegan sources can be lower than that of animal sources. And so with me, when I'm typically working with clients, I will lean more towards them getting protein from animal sources. And this is for a couple of reasons. So firstly, it's really common when I start with clients that they've been under eating protein. And this is mostly unintentionally. But when I look through their logs and there's multiple days a week where barely any protein has come in. So there's a real need to make up for a shortfall as well as what they currently need, like the shortfall of what they currently need, but also going back to what's happened historically. And for me, animal sources seem to be the thing that is most quick at repairing this situation. And this is particularly true for clients who are previously vegetarians or vegans, and have maybe over the years started to include a little more meat or a little more fish in their diet, but it's still pretty protein sparse. When they start to up their meat or their fish or their shellfish, or even things like eggs, they just notice such an immediate impact. And in a number of weeks, they can have a huge difference. But if I'm trying to do this from vegetarian sources, I don't often notice that same bump, and that this is just from what I've experienced through working with clients, and part of the reason why I think this is the case, which is really reason 2 for my preference towards animal sources, is to do with digestibility and what I just talked about in terms of the idea of bioavailability. People often have a real hard time digesting things like beans or pulses or legumes or quinoa or those types of foods. And when they have this stuff, they get gas or bloating or discomfort. And part of this is obviously due to protein deficiency or insufficiencies that have historically happened for them, and that's meant that their digestion has become weaker, especially that digestion within the stomach. And part of this I also think is due to just where they're sitting from a metabolic standpoint. And when someone is in a lower metabolic state, when stress has been a real big factor as part of their everyday life, your body down regulates digestion. It's not important. Your body's trying to get you out of like harm's way, like really go for safety and security, and to put a whole heap of resources into digestion, it feels like it's doing something for long-term health when it really should just be focusing on short-term survival. So if we can then get more of the animal sources of protein in to start with, digestion as a whole can then start to upregulate. And what this then means is that over the long run, clients then start to include more of and start to tolerate more of the vegetarian sources of protein, and then their animal sources of protein can be lowered. And this isn't always the case, or it might not be the case for all sources of vegetarian protein, but definitely I would say for the majority of clients. So for me, like really biofeedback and someone's digestive capabilities guide the protein choices. Like if someone from day one can eat lots of vegetarian protein sources and they can digest them and they do well of them, then I encourage people to eat them. And there's a ton of research looking at the benefits of bean consumption and its association with improved health markers and with longevity. And look, like all foods, I think there are some drawbacks with beans and pulses, and there are some negative issues with it, but I'm also not going to argue with the research that then looks at all this stuff. And so if I can get someone to be eating more of these vegetarian sources of protein and them doing really well on it, then for me, that's really the end goal. And that doesn't mean that someone then has to go down the route of being vegetarian or vegan. It means, how can we be getting the best different types of protein in that support that person and seeing where that means that they end up. So I want to now single out a handful of different protein sources and just talk about some of them. So the first one is meat. And for a lot of people, protein just means meat, especially if someone's coming from more of the paleo world or the low carb world, or like an Atkins type diet. Like, protein really means like big chunks of meat for a lot of people. I know I'm generalizing here. And when I look at what certain clients are eating, they seem to live their life off like skinless chicken breasts. And this is really the only meat that they eat in certain situations. And from my perspective, variety is really the key. And I suggest that people eat a real mixture of different types of meat. So beef and lamb and chicken, having game meats like partridge and pheasant and rabbit and venison and like pigeon and that kind of thing. And I know some of this stuff isn't like A, to everyone's taste, B, not everyone has butchers or places that they can source this kind of stuff. But I would say getting in as much of a mixed source as you can be is my suggestion with this stuff. One thing I would want to mention with this is that muscle meats in excess can cause a problem. So within an animal, you have different types of meat sources within them. So you have the organs, you have like the connective tissues and the bones and the protein that comes out of that. And then you have the muscles. And historically, if you look at how we used to eat, we would use the whole animal. So using all of the different parts. Whereas today, we just want the prime cuts of the muscle meats. And the thing about muscle meats is they contain high amounts of certain types of amino acids. So methionine, tryptophan, and cysteine are certain amino acids that they contain in high amounts that can be very inflammatory, and they can have an anti-metabolic effect. So these amino acids in excess are often associated with aging. And it doesn't mean that you have to avoid them entirely, but you want to either A, keep them on the lower side, or B, if you're not keeping them on the lower side, you want to then be balancing them out with some of the more anti-inflammatory amino acids. And the one amino acid that seems to get the most attention for its role as being like anti-inflammatory is called glycine. And this is found in high quantities in bone, in connective tissue, in collagen. It's in like gelatin powder. It's also in really decent amounts in scallops. And this again comes back to the idea of why eating nose to tail and eating the whole animal can help to eliminate some of the problems that protein can be causing versus people just eating very high amounts of muscle meats. I would also just add to that like fish and also eggs fall into this same category of having higher amounts of these inflammatory amino acids. So even if you're thinking, I don't eat a lot of meat, I eat mostly fish and eggs as my protein, this could still be an issue if these aren't then balanced out with other forms of protein or other forms that contain some of those anti-inflammatory amino acids. So a simple solution to this that I use with clients is to be getting them to be making broths from bone. And I know bone broth has become this new trendy thing, and you can get it in different cafes, or you can get it in different places. I know in the UK and things like Pret, and it's become very overblown in terms of a lot of what people talk about. And again, I've written an article about the benefits of bone broth, and some of it is overhyped and some of it is definitely true. So I'll link to that article as part of this. But because it contains that high amount of gelatin, which is got a very nourishing form of protein that contains things like glycine and also another amino acid called proline. These amino acids are very anti-inflammatory. They also help with the growth and repair of the digestive tract. They're important for things like insulin sensitivity and for the nervous system. And glycine in particular is incredibly important in terms of liver detoxification. And so before, when I said about protein sources that can help for digestion and to help that stomach acidity come back up, even if someone's got low amounts of stomach acidity and is really struggling to digest protein, gelatin and also like coming from bone broth is a really good source for that. So you can make it using things like chicken carcasses, you can use beef and lamb bones, or going slightly more exotic with things like oxtail or chicken's feet or pig's trotters. For me personally, like oxtail is the best form because I think it makes a really nice, rich broth. You get tons of gelatin coming out of the bones from the oxtail, and then you also get the really nice meat from the oxtail as well. So you're getting a really good balanced protein source. An even simpler way, and this is what often ends up happening with most of my clients, is that we will use a gelatin powder. And the gelatin powder that I use is by Great Lakes, and they do two different versions. There's one in a green tub and there's one in an orange tub. The one in the orange tub is like normal gelatin in terms of it then creates jelly. So you can create jelly type snacks with it, whether you're talking about jelly or panna cotta or making like your own version of like gummy squares, that kind of thing. But the one I normally use with people is the one that's in the green tin, and this has been hydrolyzed. So it actually then dissolves in both hot and cold liquids, and it's totally tasteless. So people can then be adding it to their foods and their drinks. So if you're having a tea or a coffee or having a glass of orange juice, you can put in that. If you're having a bowl of cereal, or if you're having some soup, you can put it in that. Basically anything that's got some liquid in it that you can dissolve it into, you can have it. And as I say, it's tasteless. And that's a very easy way for someone to be getting up their glycine content as well as their proline content, which, as I said, both of these are very anti-inflammatory. Added to this is possibly why beans and pulses are associated with positive health outcomes, because they are also lower in those lower in the inflammatory amino acids. And so while there may be certain issues with people being able to digest this stuff or them having anti-nutrients, if someone can be tolerating beans and pulses, then I think they should be including them as part of their diet, because it will help to bring down the number of that inflammatory amino acids as a total of someone's protein intake. So the next protein source I want to mention is organ meats. And so this is something that is very much out of favor today for most people. I know within certain movements, whether it be paleo or Western A Price, they really talk about the benefits of organ meats, and it is very common for people to hear about this, but for most people, they just don't eat them today. And it's a little sad because I think they are very nutritious and much more nutrient dense than the muscle meats that most people favor. And because they're so nutrient dense, you don't need to be having very much of them to be getting the benefit. So for example, if I use liver, like liver is one of those things that if you can be having it once a week, it can make a really huge difference. And I understand that organ meats in comparison to muscle meats have a very strong and distinct taste, and it's really not to everyone's palate. So the kind of options that I would suggest here to get around this is you can be sticking to the less strong tasting organ meats. So instead of maybe going for the kidneys or going for like beef liver, you can go for things like chicken livers, or you can go for sweetbreads. Or you can be hiding the different types of organ meats in other foods. So if you're making a minced dish, so something like spaghetti bolognese, or you're making a lasagna, you can be then adding small amounts to this where you're not really going to taste it. Or you can be having something like liverwurst, which has then also got lots of other mince in it. And again, you can have it where it feels more palatable. It's not you trying to hold your nose and just get this stuff down. If you don't like organ meats, then honestly, don't worry about this. Like, I would say about 10 to 20% of my clients actually eat them. And most of the time with people, it's just getting them to make a little bit of chicken liver pate. And if I know for myself personally, liver is probably the only organ meat that I eat, except if I go to a restaurant and I see that sweetbreads are on the menu, I'll have that. But I find that they can often be difficult to come by apart from when I'm at a restaurant. And even with me eating liver, it's normally me making chicken liver pate, or me doing chicken livers the same way as I would make the pate and then just eating them whole, as opposed to putting them in the blender and making the pate out of them. And honestly, for me, that probably happens a couple of times a month. I should be better on this thing. I know the benefits of it, but in reality, it just doesn't happen as much as it probably should. The final protein source I just want to mention is shellfish. So things like oysters, mussels, scallops, prawns, those kinds of things. This is a protein that I really regularly suggest that clients include. Probably in a similar way to organ meats, for stuff like scallops or for oysters, you don't need to have huge amounts. Like having this once a week would be like really amazing. And really, the stuff that comes from the sea is just so supportive to like thyroid health and metabolism, because it contains high amounts of iodine and copper and zinc and selenium. And so like really anything that comes from the sea can be helpful, but the shellfish just has this stuff in so much abundance. I know for lots of people, this isn't the easiest food for them to come by, especially if someone lives inland. So getting fresh sources of this isn't often very doable or practical or even available at all. And I'm also aware that a lot of these things are not the cheapest foods. So not everyone is going to be able to afford to have them or have them regularly. But even if you can have something like tinned oysters, it can then be very helpful to be getting in this as a good protein source, but also because of the other vitamins and minerals that come as part of this. So I now want to look at how much protein you need and how you can roughly work this out. So the Department of Health for the UK recommends you get 55 grams of protein a day if you're a male, and you then get 45 grams of protein a day if you're a female. For the dietary reference intake, so the DRI in the USA, it's 0.8 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. So that works out at 0.36 grams per pound. And so this amounts to around about 56 grams per day for the average sedentary man and around 46 grams per day for the average sedentary woman. So if the general recommendation is that you eat 2,000 calories if you're a female and you eat 2,500 calories if you're a male, these recommendations in the UK and in the US works out at around about 9% of total calories coming from protein. And personally, I think these recommendations are way too low. And it's not just me that thinks this. There are countless studies that show that a higher percentage of protein intake can be much more beneficial. So the typical recommendations when looking at these other reference points is that you need between 1.5 and 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of lean mass, which works out at about 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of lean mass. So for a lot of people, they can just look at what is their current weight and then do the calculation. As someone's weight becomes heavier, and as more of this heavier weight is from fat as opposed to muscle, then they need to do a calculation based on what they would weigh if they were leaner, to then work out the protein estimate. So for example, if someone weighs 250 pounds and they are completely ripped and they're just this wall of muscle, then their calculation is going to be largely based on their 250 pound weight. Whereas if someone is 250 pounds, that they're much higher as a fat percentage, then their protein needs are going to be on the lower side. And when they calculate this, they should be looking at, okay, what's my given frame? And if I was leaner, where would I weigh roughly to then work out that figure? And as part of working out these figures in terms of protein intake, someone's exercise also needs to be taken into consideration. And so someone who is more active probably needs to be pushing that protein figure up a little bit more. Someone who's less active can be pulling it down a little bit more. It's not going to need huge amounts of shifts. I think it needs to have more of a shift upwards as the intensity gets higher and higher in terms of what someone's doing. But I think that should be factored in a little bit. But honestly, I would say that really, I'm probably complicating things more than it needs to. And for most, they just don't need to think about it in this level of detail. And so typically when working with people, I recommend that the minimum protein intake is somewhere around about 90 grams of protein a day. And often I want them to be having more than this. And we generally play around with protein figures somewhere between about 20 and 25% of total calories, sometimes getting up to 30%. And then we look at, based on how many calories they need, what the grams is going to be as part of this. But I would say for most people, shooting for somewhere around about 20 to 25% as a ballpark, and then kind of moving up or down from that is where they should start. And a big part of these numbers and where someone ends up is due to the feedback from the client and how they feel best. And that's looking at lots of different factors in terms of different symptoms that they're getting. So how's their sleep? How's their mood? How's their energy? How's their recovery from exercise? How's their recovery from illness? All of those different things. But other factors. So as I mentioned before, like what are the exercises they do? What's the intensity of exercise? What kind of work are they doing? What's their age? Like what's their previous protein history? So if someone was eating low protein before, and as I said, this often happens unintentionally, maybe in the short term, we need to be pulling that number up. So there's lots of different factors that come into this. But my sense is that the recommendations that have come from like more of the government level in terms of the Department of Health and then the dietary recommendation or reference intakes, they're probably too low for what most people genuinely need. One final thing I want to mention with this, from my perspective, is often the myopic focus on protein when people are trying to build muscle. So yes, protein is important for building muscle, but there is a tipping point where this stops being so effective. And this is because you're then starting to miss out on other macronutrients, so carbs and fat, that are also needed as part of the diet and are also a really important source of energy. So if protein is, say, super high as a percentage of calories, that means that carbs and then fat are then going to be needing to be lower. And in that situation, the body starts to use more of the protein as an energy source because not enough's coming in from fat and carbs. And it's not very good at doing this. Like protein isn't great at doing that job. And what should be happening is you're allowing the body to use carbohydrates and fat to do this role instead because they're much better at doing it. And then allowing the protein to be used for building the muscle and all the other functions that I talked about earlier on that protein is genuinely good at doing. So there's a point where adding in more protein becomes fairly counterproductive because it means you're then missing out on the other macronutrients, which are a better energy source. So this is possibly something to keep in mind if you're going to the gym constantly, because what I see often in these situations is people just like chugging back on protein shake after protein shake, often being fearful of carbs and or fat, and actually they're missing out on the benefits of having those things come in. And you get to a situation where someone brings down their protein intake, takes up their carbs and fat intake, and they see improvements in their everyday health, but also you see improvements in terms of building up muscle and building up their ability to actually exercise properly in whatever exercise they're doing. So yeah, definitely not being so myopic in terms of protein, and protein being like the be all and end all in terms of building muscle and being important for exercise, because that's definitely not the case. So that is it for this week's show, and I hope you found it enlightening on protein's different roles within the body and how different factors can impact on the amount or the different types that are needed. So have a good week, and I'll catch you in the next show.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.